Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala jami' al-anbiya'i wa mursaleen. Wa ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa barik wa sallam. All praise are due to Allah, Lord of the worlds, and peace and blessings be upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad and upon all of the prophets, Moses, Jesus, Abraham, and all those righteous ones from the beginning of time. And I begin with the greeting words of the righteous. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah, it is again a great privilege to be here in Concordia, in Montreal. And I want to congratulate the Muslim Student Association again for this initiative. It is very important that we begin to share information and also to open up the borders of our minds. And this program coincides with Black History Month. And the founder of Black History Month, this is Dr. Carter G. Woodson in the United States. This is in 1926, is when this concept came about. And he chose February, not because it has anything to do with African people, because this is the coldest month of the year, but because this was the birth of President Abraham Lincoln and also Frederick Douglass, who was an African-American struggler against slavery. The United States made it official in 1976, and Canada made it official in 1995. And the original concept behind this month was to have a different perspective relative to people of African descent, to open up our thinking, to open up our minds. And what Carter G. Woodson and the historians in this field were looking at is the fact that slavery itself, which was a terrible institution here in the West, was of two types. There is a physical slavery, but there is also mental slavery. So that if physical slavery, colonialism, apartheid, or any oppressive system is lifted off the individuals who are oppressed, if their minds are still colonized, if they are still a slave in their mind, then even though their body is liberated, they're still in slavery. So the concept is now to liberate the mind, to open up our way of thinking. And because of this, I want to share with you some information, what I would consider to be some shocking information. And some of the things that I might say to you is going to shock the way that you think and your concept of history. And this is part of growth, because in the history departments, and I studied for a master's and PhD in history department in the University of Toronto, they teach us that in order to understand the subject, you need to go to primary sources. You don't just go to a secondary source. You try to get different opinions of it, put it together with the most objective way of looking. But the key issue in any objective study is the primary source. And so tonight's look will be looking at the issue of resistance to slavery from an African perspective, from a Muslim perspective, in a little bit different way than what you normally have gotten in the mainstream secular curriculums. But also, for those Muslims who are here tonight, it's also going to challenge some of your concepts of early Islam. And to begin with, I want to deal with the concept of stereotyping and the concept of misinformation. Because we have grown up in a society that has fed us information in a systematic way. It makes us think in a certain way, and you have to challenge the information. You have to begin to think outside the box and challenge some of the facts, so-called facts, that are being given to you in your curriculums and in your books. And just to give you an example, some of the clearest examples, probably the clearest example for me, and one of the most important examples is this bit of information that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. And I traveled to different parts of the world, and I asked people in China, who discovered America? They said Christopher Columbus. And I said, when? They said 1492. But the question that I asked them, and I also posed to my teachers when I was young and growing up here in North America, is a very simple question. How can you discover a place when the people are living there already? Think about this. How can you say you discovered it? Because if you say you discovered a place, that means nobody's there. There's no civilization. And so it wouldn't be so bad if it was just Columbus's delusion that he actually discovered America. But the problem is, this became one of the most important historical facts. Like when you look at history, they have BC changing into AD, right? And then 1492 is sort of a change point. This 15th century, Renaissance, it's a change point in history. So this becomes a key axiom in your understanding of the world. The problem is, right from the outset, it's a lie. So we have based our information on something which is false and which actually is an insult to the people who lived in this area. We have to recognize that indigenous culture in this part of the world goes 10,000 or more years into the past. That indigenous people came here crossing from Russia, crossing the Bering Straits, also coming across the Pacific Ocean. And this has been a wave of people that came for a long period of time. We tend to reduce it because in our minds, we're not giving all aspects of history its weight. So we reduce the past, and then we make the past 100 years or so to appear as though that's the most important aspects of history itself. This picture you're seeing is the Inca civilization in Peru. And when they flew over this and looked down, they found the grid of a city, and this is hundreds of years before Columbus. They found the grid of a city which could rival any city on earth at the time. And the indigenous people had built civilizations. It is said that actually over 75 million people were living in the Americas when Columbus came. Think about this. 75 million people, over 2,000 mutually exclusive languages. 2,000 languages. Many of the products that we take for granted in the world came from here. Corn came from the Americas. Tomatoes, potatoes. You can go on, you'll be shocked at some of the natural products that came from the Americas. And when I say the Americas, I mean North, Central, Caribbean, and South America. You'll be shocked at some of the things that are there. So even if we look, to Europeans who came to this part of the world, and we in Canada know that the Vikings came across also before Columbus, and we have the ruins in the eastern side of Canada. So Columbus was not even the first European to discover America. The reality was that Columbus wasn't sure where he was. According to his reading of history and geography and sailing, he thought he was in the islands off the coast of China. He thought he was near India, actually, maybe on the islands, so he called people Indians. And up until today, some people use it, not Indians. It's the wrong terminology. And when Columbus went back to Spain, he couldn't properly explain to the king and queen of Castilla and Aragon, he couldn't explain where he had been. So they sent him back again, because they were looking for gold. And the key point, for those of you who are into history, the key point of 1492 is not Columbus discovering America. The key point is the fact that Granada, which is the last stronghold of Muslims in Western Europe, it was surrendered in 1492. And Muslims, after over 800 years living in that part of the world, indigenous Europeans in Spain who had embraced Islam, after a struggle and weakness within the Muslim community, Muslims were expelled, exterminated, and in 1492, Abu Abdullah, who's known as Boabdil, he surrendered Granada. That's the key point of 1492. But you know what I found out on a journey to Spain? That when Ferdinand and Isabella made a treaty with Abu Abdullah, when they finished this treaty and he was leaving, Columbus was at the door. It was a key point. And Columbus promised the king and queen gold. He said, now you have your empire, you need finance, and I can help you. So they financed him, and he went out to the Americas, and he never got off the islands. His son Ferdinand went on to the mainland. And what did Ferdinand see? If you look at the picture there, if you look closely, you see the little dots that are around the bottom of the pyramid? These are people. See the size of the pyramid? This is in Mexico. So this is not a weak civilization. This is a huge civilization, which has calendars, philosophy, all the different elements of what we call a high civilization. So we need to start to deconstruct information. That means you get information, you challenge it, you deconstruct it, and then you rewrite it in a positive way. This is going to face you throughout your careers as students. And if I had the opportunity to rewrite the book, which is very difficult to get into curriculums, it's the Holy Grail, I would say that Columbus was discovered in 1492. You understand the difference between these two sentences? Because he was lost, and he bumped into the Americas on his way to India. You see? That's deconstruction and reconstruction. Okay? So, another important point, again, looking at history, is that people who do not know their history will be lost in the present. And I say this with all respects to our Muslim community here. We are in crucial need of the understanding of our own history, because it is something which has been left out of our curriculums in the colonial period. And a different form of history has been put in, which gives us a total misunderstanding of where we actually came from. Africa is another good example. And for many European writers, Africa meant a dark continent, a backward place. And up until today, if you took the common student, I did this in the Toronto Board of Education. If you go to students and you say apple, or if you say sugar, they say sweet. You say ice, they say cold. Psychological test, right? Try it on somebody. Say Africa. What comes in their mind? What would come in your mind? I mean, some of you may be from Africa, but what comes in your mind? Right? If you say Africa, violence, right? People fighting each other, poverty, destruction. And then the young people, after they talked about poverty and violence, they start talking about lions and tigers and elephants and things like this, right? This is what came in their mind when they talked about Africa. It's a dark place. Unfortunately, on the highest levels of academia, this was going on. This map, which is the Mercator map, which is used by people for a long period of time, There are some new, the Peters projection and some new ones that are coming along. It distorted the size of Africa to make you think that Europe is almost the size of North Africa. The reality is that Africa is larger than India and China put together. You can put India and China inside of Africa and Europe, and you still have room. It's a huge continent. But part of the colonization of the mind of the people on this continent was to make them think that they are small and they haven't made achievements. Reality is, when we go back, and I want to go back with you in history, when you talk about ancient Egypt, and people think about the ancient Egyptians, and for some people before they would think about the ancient Egyptians, and they might think about the Cleopatra, Elizabeth Taylor, or they will think about now they have the mummies, the return of the mummy, attacking you and things like this. You know what's shocking that I found in Egypt? And I didn't take it from a book. I went there. I went up south. I went south and went down underneath the ground into the tombs. And some shocking information came out. This tablet here is the tablet of Menes, who was one of the early leaders there in ancient Egypt. And he united Upper and Lower Egypt in 3200 BC. Okay, so Upper Egypt, remember, the Nile flows south, north. Okay, because the mountains are in the south, in Uganda and in Ethiopia, and the mountain, and it flows down, but it's going north, right? So you have to adjust the way that you are thinking. So it's around 3200 BC that he unites Egypt, and it becomes a powerful state. Okay, but what's shocking is they even found out that in 3500 BC, in a place called Tarseti, they actually found the ruins of a civilization, and that they found 12 kings. This would be northern Sudan, in a place called the Sudan now. So they were somewhere around 3500 BC. But what is important about this time, because when you generally think about BC, right, what comes in your mind with BC? Right? Cavemen, right? Hitting each other with clubs. Right? Ignorance, right? That's BC, that's before civilization. Okay, this is what comes inside of your mind. But you know what happened in this time? This is the step pyramid of Saqqara. And this is around 2650 BC that this pyramid was built. 2650 BC. It's still standing today. And if you add that together, right, this is somewhere around 4,000, close to 5,000 years old that this building is, and it's still standing. If we have a national house or a monument here in Quebec, which is 100 years old, that's a national monument. Okay, this is 4,000 years old plus. And this pyramid was actually built for Zosa, who was a great pharaoh, and there were many pharaohs. Pharaoh is a title, right? It's a title. Muslims, many people, because of the pharaoh around the time of Moses, of Musa alayhi salam. So people think of Pharaoh, all of the pharaohs were like this pharaoh, who was probably Ramses, or maybe his son, or like one of his sons. Okay? But actually there are hundreds of pharaohs. Pharaoh is a title, like prime minister, or like king, and there were all types of leaders and whatnot. Some of the pharaohs I actually found out believed in one God. There's Ptahhotep, the writings of Ptahhotep, and there are others, who actually had belief in one God. Now, this set of pyramids is the pyramid at Giza. Okay? And these are the famous pyramid of Giza. Now, what is surprising about this? Remember now, the people came from the south and they went north. So the original Egyptians were African people, what you call today Nubian people. They were African people who migrated north, which is going down. Okay, and this is actually the remains, the bust of Khufu, who was the pharaoh at the time of the building of the Great Pyramid. Okay, clearly an African person. And I say this specifically because this is something which is not on our minds at all. Okay, what is important about this? The pyramid itself is one of the wonders of the world. If you look closely, can you see the white vehicle there on the side? That's a water truck. Look at the size of this building. This pyramid has got within it somewhere around 2,300,000 blocks of granite in one structure. Some of these blocks of granite weigh 20 tons. They average about 2.5 tons. And they were placed in perfect positions. And what's shocking about this building, now remember our history, right? This was the tallest building in the world until the 19th century. Until the 19th century, there was no other building on earth that was as tall as this. And this was built by African people. And when you look at the pyramid itself, it's shocking because the corners of the pyramid are perfect north, south, east, and west orientation. Perfect orientation. And it's like a perfect square. They measured it, and there's only about 8 inches difference in the sides. 8 inches. And this is something which was built 2,500 BC. Okay? But the Greeks tell you they invented math. Right? You look in your book, they say the Greeks. But the ancient Greeks themselves, they were not racist people. If you go to the Greek writings, the Greeks say, we got our civilization from the Egyptians. And they were dark-skinned people with curly hair. That's what the Greeks said. But recent racism has now deleted this information to make you think that the people who built this were a Mediterranean people who were similar to the Greeks, again giving false information. Look at the size of these stones. You know what's shocking about it? That's me there, right? So you see how big it is? That's me. Look at the size of that stone. How did they put it in place? Don't tell me that the Pharaoh was a wicked king and he had slaves and he beat the slaves. Did the slaves put it on their heads? That's not possible. You have to have mastery of physics. You have to understand science. They cut this out of granite from Aswan. They took it all the way from Aswan and they took it north, which is going down, and they put it in place. And the shocking thing is that there's no cement. There's no cement. They cut it perfect and they put it in place. How can this be if in books, even some of the big so-called historians say that Africa has done nothing for the onward flow of civilization? Think about this statement. Okay? No cement is inside of this. And it is shocking. And the columns, their universities that they had at Karnak, you go to Thebes, and you'll see they had a university there. And look at the size of the columns here. And that's what's left up until today. But people say, oh no, it's the Romans and the Greeks. Look at the column here. You see, Greek civilization did not did not kick in until around 8th century BC. 700 BC, right? This is 2,000 years before the Greeks that the Egyptians had these pyramids. But in our minds, the Greeks started the civilization. You see? So we have to reorientate our way of thinking completely in order to understand the truth. And then they say, no, 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 it was in England, Stonehenge. Compare that Stonehenge to the pyramids. Right? You want to talk about civilization, right? But people arrogantly talk as though their civilization is the primary civilization. So we have to open up the way that we are thinking. Yes, there is Ramses. That's a picture of Ramses. Ramses, because of the power that he had, he went crazy. And he wanted everybody to worship him. And also his son and his grandson, it was one of them, probably his son, who was the Pharaoh, the Pharaoh, in the time of Moses, Musa alayhi salam. And he's the one who thought he was God. And that is when they lost their power and authority. They start going down when they thought that they were gods. And this is the obelisk, which is there. And everybody, most of the big cities of the world have obelisks. Washington, D.C. has got an obelisk. Toronto, we have the CN Tower. Do you have an obelisk here in Montreal? Well, they have a little one, right? Toronto's got a big one, right? So these are symbols of your power, right? Some of them stole the obelisk right out of Egypt itself or Ethiopia. Now, you know what is shocking also about African history? It is that the ancient Aksumite Empire, this is what is now known as Ethiopia and Eritrea, that in this area here in Aksum, they had the largest obelisk in the world. Not Egypt, Ethiopia. And these are the Ethiopian people, these are black African people who were in power at the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and before him. You remember the story of the elephants, Ashab al-Fil. There's a chapter in the Quran about an army which was sent by the Ethiopians into Arabia. And they had elephants in the army. It was one of the most powerful mechanized armies in the world. The elephants were like tanks, helicopter gunships. Today you have drones, right? This was the drones of the time. So this was a powerful weapon that this army had. These were the African people. Just before the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, Amul Fil, the year of the elephants, was when he was born. So you have to change your thinking when you're thinking about Africa, especially in relationship to the early Muslims. Now, what usually comes in when you talk about Africa, you go into your history classes, it's usually slavery. And when it comes to Muslims and Arabs in particular, it's like a stereotype, right? Arabs, slavery. They try to put the two together. And we need to deconstruct some information here tonight. And this is going to be a little bit different than what you've read in the past. Number one, let's go back to the origins of slavery. Realize that slavery is a worldwide institution. The ancient Babylonians, it's mentioned here, one of the earliest mentions is 2,000 years before Christ. They clearly, spoke about, slavery. But basically, it was a worldwide institution. The Chinese had it. They had some of the largest numbers of slaves. The slaves were usually used for labor or concubines in the places of kings. And surprisingly enough, we use the word slave. It comes from Slav. You know Slavic people? Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia. Slavic people, right? They were enslaved by the Romans. And they eventually helped to destroy Rome. And so the Romans used Slav like a slave. Most of their slaves were not black people. Most of their slaves were white European people. And so up until today, we're using the word Slav or slave for this institution. And in Roman times, the slaves were more than half of the population of Rome. And you can see representations. I won't spend a long time on this, but even in their representations, they make the slaves as a small person and the free person as a large one. So what was happening in the world, all over the world, is that people were either free or slave. And a wealthy Roman person, you could buy slaves in a marketplace. Slaves had different jobs. Some of them were skilled. Some of them rose up and had a lot of wealth. Okay? And, but one of the key issues in slavery, this form of slavery, was that the slave was considered property. The property of the owner. Right? But the institution of slavery itself had different forms. There were different forms that it took in different parts of the world. The main sources of slaves in the world was either kidnapping or a debt. You owe something, so you give your child. This is happening up until today. In some very poor countries, they'll give their child in order to pay a debt. Punishments for crimes, sometimes your lineage. But one of the big sources of slavery was warfare. Because in ancient times, they did not have prisoner of war camps. So either they would kill you or they would integrate you into their society. And slavery was in Europe. It was in the Americas, even amongst indigenous people. There were people in conquered nations who were integrated into their societies. Every society on earth had this. It's almost like you have today employer, employee. It's a worldwide institution. And this lasted in the world up until maybe the 18th century. When Islam came, it systematically struggled against slavery. And it basically was phasing out the concept of being a slave. And the only thing that was left is what I would call bonded servitude. So the word slave is not even the right word. That's the only thing that was left. And slaves were not just African people in Arabia, by the way. The Prophet's great companion Zayd, radiallahu anh, he was originally a slave. He was an Arab. Salman al-Farisi, radiallahu anh, the Persian, who was a great companion of the Prophet, he was a slave. Suhaib al-Rumi, the Iraqi Arab who looked like a European, he was a slave. So slavery was basically a person who did not have the power to control their own life, so they came under the control of another person, and you have different levels of things. What Islam was doing, it was basically phasing it out. And the Quran itself, the book of scripture of the Muslims, was encouraging the Muslims to free a slave, free a slave. If you go back to the first generation, you will see that the companions of the Prophet ﷺ basically freed their slaves. And there was no slave raiding at that time. You will not see it in the time of the Khulafa al-Rashidin. These are the rightly guided caliphs. So the original society of Islam was basically phasing out human bondage. It was phasing out slavery. Okay? And it would be a period of time. But it was set to phase it out. It was only later on afterwards, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, after his death, that many of the kings who embraced Islam, when Islam became an imperial power, they took on practices of other imperial nations, not following the example of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, but copying imperial nations, and so you see slavery instituted, but it is not the original society. It is not what was happening in the time of the companions. Why is this important? It's important because there's a difference between Islam itself, the way of life Islam, and Muslims. A Muslim is one who tries to be to the highest standard, but is not necessarily on the highest standard. Who were the best Muslims? What is the highest standard of Muslims that we look at in order to judge where we stand? Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said in a tradition, he said it in different ways, but he said in one tradition, خَيْرُ النَّاسِ قَرْنِي ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ. He said the best of people is my generation. Then the one that followed them, then the generation that follows them. So it's the first 3 generations where you will find the highest standard of the practice of Islam. What was happening during that time? My thesis, the basis of what I'm saying, is that the early Muslims were an anti-slavery, anti-oppression group. They were fighting against oppression on all levels. And when they used to describe the companions of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the leaders of Mecca, called the Quraysh, they used to say, here comes Muhammad with these slaves and low-class people. Even though the Prophet himself, he had a noble lineage, the majority of his followers were actually slaves. Or they were people of low class within society. And by the 5th year of the prophethood, his people were being persecuted. They were being tortured to death. And so the Prophet ﷺ, then he said to his companions, travel in the land. And these are some pictures that I took in Ethiopia, by the way. These are actually in the area where they may have been. He told them, travel in the land. And they traveled in the land. And the Prophet said to them, if you go to Al-Habasha, Abyssinia, it would be better for you, for in it there is a king who will not tolerate oppression. It is a land of truth. Hiya ardu sidq. Go until such time as Allah shall relieve you from your distress. Look what he's saying. This is Aksum. Remember the elephants, right? He said, go over to that society. The people there were Christians. And Christendom was divided amongst the people who followed the original teachings of Jesus, Isa alayhi salam, which is one God, and the other group that followed the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. This is when the Trinity was brought in and the Bible, present-day Bible, was put together. Look it up, Council of Nicaea, right, 325 AD. Before that time, there was a number of groups within Christendom. And the leader at that time in Ethiopia, or in Al-Habasha, his name was Ashama. His title was An-Najashi. An-Najashi. You say in English, the Negus, right? In his language, they say Nagash. He was Tigray. Any Ethiopians here? He was Tigray. If you know Ethiopia, right? It's a powerful group in Ethiopia. Okay, that's what he was. And but the shahid here, the witness is the Prophet, when he spoke about Ethiopia, Habasha, he said, Hiya ardu sidq. It is a land of truth. Go to this place. Go there. So his companions, who were basically downtrodden people, mostly slaves, mostly underclass people, went across the Red Sea and they went into Al-Habasha. And the Prophet ﷺ wrote a letter to the king, to the emperor. This letter is a diplomatic letter. And you can see it on the left side. They still have a copy of the letter in the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul, in Turkey. And he said in translation, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, from Muhammad, the Messenger of Allah, to the great Negus of Abyssinia, peace be upon you, follows the guidance, as to what follows. Verily, for you I praise Allah, the one whom there is no deity except Him, the sole King, the Holy, the source of peace, the protector, and the guardian. You see how he writes his letter? This is a Muslim, this is a prophet of Islam writing to a Christian king. How does he start? He said, I praise Allah, and he starts giving names and descriptions of Allah. Right? So he's defining who he means by the Creator. Then he continues, I bear witness that Jesus, the son of Maryam, is the spirit belonging to Allah and his word, which he cast into the chaste and excellent Virgin Maryam. She thus became pregnant by means of his spirit and his inspiration with Jesus in the same manner that he created Adam with his hand. This is a powerful statement. You see? Now, that sounds like Christianity there, that God breathed his spirit and his word. They use that. Kalimatuhu. He breathed his word into her, and she became pregnant. Nobody else but Christians believe that Mary was a virgin. He now shows how close we are. But he qualifies it. See what he says at the end? He said, in the same way that he created Adam with his hand. So in other words, Jesus is created, right? But he's not God. Adam was created too, right? You see that argument? If you're going to say, well, Jesus is God because he didn't have a father, what about Adam? Adam had no father and no mother. See what he's doing here? Okay? He's defining it. Then he said, verily, and this is an important statement, I invite you to Allah, the one who has no partner, and to friendship and continuity and government in obedience to him. Thus I have delivered the message and given you counsel. Therefore accept my counsel. Peace be upon he who follows the guidance. And in one translation, it said, I invite you and your government forces to Allah. Junud. You know what that would mean? Think about this. You got to think differently now. If the Ethiopians embraced Islam, his junud, right? Elephants, right? If they embraced Islam and they came back with the companions to Mecca, you wouldn't have to go to Medina, because the war would be over then. Muslims would then control Mecca. So this is a strategic move that he's making by inviting powerful African people to come to assist oppressed African and other people who were slaves. So this is an anti-slavery, anti-imperialist struggle that was going on. That's the first generation of Muslims. It's not kings who are raiding for slaves and kings who are smoking hashish and they have a harem. Ali Baba and the 40 thieves. This is fantasy which is being fed to us. This is our reality from the beginning. This here right now in Ethiopia, if you visit Ethiopia, is Masjid Najashi. And you can go to Ethiopia. The Turkish government is now repairing this mosque. Najashi is buried there. Ashama radiallahu anh. He was recognized as a Muslim. When he died, the Prophet, peace be upon him, made Salatul Janazah lil Ghaib. It was the funeral prayer for an absent person for the first time. So he embraced Islam, and there are 15 Sahabas who are buried there with him. You can read it in the great books of Islam. 15 Sahabas are also buried there. And this is the city Nagash that is there in the Tigray province in what is now known as Ethiopia. Okay? But you know what a lot of people don't realize? When the Prophet ﷺ made the call to hijrah to Medina, migration to Medina, and the people left Ethiopia, and they went to Medina, 32 Abyssinians were with them. 32 went into the community. Normally if you say, are there any African people amongst the community? Say, Bilal. Right? Radiallahu anhu. And Bilal is our hero. But he's not the only Abyssinian African person who was there. There is a number of significant people. And you have to realize by this alone, 32 coming into the community, as well as other people, it's shocking to find some of the male Abyssinian Sahaba. There's Bilal ibn Rabah, Manhaj al-Habashi, Abu Bakr al-Habashi, Shukran al-Habashi, Dhu Makhma, Dhu Mahdan al-Habashi, Dhu Dajjal, Dhu Manahib, Khalid ibn Hawari, Khalid ibn Rabah. Did you know Bilal had a brother? Does anybody know that? That's some new information tonight, right? His brother was named Khalid. Okay? Aslam, Sa, Yasa, Hilal, Wahshi, Asim, Na'il, Laqit, Ji'al, Ibrahim, Abraha ibn Saba, and so forth and so on. These are some of the other Sahabas who were described as people dark complexion. Okay? Julaybib, Sa'd al-Aswad, Salim Mawla Abi Hudhayfa. Salim, radiallahu anh, is one of the great, considered to be one of the top 5 readers of the Quran, is Salim. Okay? He was described as a dark-skinned African person. Usama ibn Zayd, you know that the dry nurse of the Prophet ﷺ, his mother, Ayman, okay, she became like his mother, and she raised him. She was an African person. She eventually married his servant who was freed, Zayd, and their son was Usama. Okay? Also, Muhajja and Mughith, these are some of the names of black companions of the Prophet Muhammad. Female companions, Ayman or Baraka, the dry nurse of the Prophet, Sa'ira, Baraka, the servant of Habiba, Ghafira bint Rabah. Did you know Bilal had a sister? Who knew that? That's some new information tonight, right? Ghafira was her name. Nabha al-Habashiyah. And there's a book in Arabic, Manhal al-Adshan fi Tarikh al-Habshan, Sayyid ibn Sadiq al-Wullu. This is a book in Arabic. He documents from At-Tabari and Ibn Kathir where he gets his information. There's also Zafar, Barira, Mihjan. There's a number of the companions. So what I'm saying to you now, this is shocking information. When the Hijrah was made, the Muhajirin who were coming to Medina were basically made up of Hijazi, Arabs, Abyssinians, and slaves. That was the first generation. So the first generation of Islam was an anti-slavery society, struggling against oppression on all different levels. And this is described by the Prophet when he said, "Khairun nas qarni, thumma alladhina yalunahum, thumma alladhina yalunahum." This is the map of Africa. And Muslims were being attacked from the north by the Byzantine Roman Empire in the lifetime of the Prophet. From the eastern side, they were attacked by the Persian Empire, the Sassanid dynasty. They responded to the attack. The Persians fell down. The Roman Empire was falling down. It was corrupted. So they took the Byzantine holdings in Philistine, in Syria, and they continued right across into Egypt. And so the fighting that was going on in North Africa and in Persia was not an aggression that was sent out by the Prophet. He sent letters to the kings. He invited them to Islam. He did not send armies against them. Their response was to attack. And so the Muslims responded to the attack. So the fighting that goes on, and this is a stereotype of Muslims, right? With a curved sword conquering the world, right? The fighting was against the Roman Empire. The Romans had conquered all along the Mediterranean region. Okay? So, Uqba ibn Nafi' established Qayrawan. This is in Tunisia. Hassan ibn Nu'man, he founded this area in Tunis. You know what they called it? Ifriqiyya. That's the first modern usage of the word Africa. Before that time, nobody was using Africa. It was an ancient Berber word, or Amazigh, the original people of North Africa. They said Ifrigo, like a warm, sunny place. So they Arabicized the word Ifriqiyya, and they put it on maps. That's where Africa comes in. So a European cartographer came later on, and he said, okay, can I find a nice word for Africa, for this place? And they said Tunisia. If you said in those days you were from South Africa, it meant you were from southern Tunisia. See the difference in thinking? And that's what a word or a map can do to your brain if you don't think out the box. So, to continue it on now, there's Ifriqiya, right? That circle, that's where Africa was at that time. Okay? Right where that circle is. Now, going across North Africa, people were embracing Islam not because of military confrontations, but because of migration, trade, scholars, pious people who were traveling on the caravans. This is how Islam was being spread across North Africa. You know what they found? They recognized below the Sahara, you see where it says Takro in West Africa, Mali, below that area on the river Niger was the largest gold mine in the world. Active gold mine. Gold was pouring out of this area. So the people of the north, which included Europeans, they were getting their gold, most of their gold from here. That's why the British even called gold guineas. Right, this is where it came from. So the Muslims then revolutionized the trade route. One of the trade routes would go from Tripoli to Ghadames, right, to Bilma and to Kanem-Bornu. Another route that you're taking there, right, the 401, 407. Your next route is from Tahert, Tad Mecca, and Gao. Your next route is from Fez, Sijil Masa, Audagast, to Kumbi Saleh. These were your trade routes. And the Tawarik people, the Amazigh of the Sahara, of the desert, they would take you across. Okay? So these were active routes. It is along these routes that Islam also began to spread. There's no huge armies going along these routes. Right? It is mainly merchants who are going on in the beginning of the spread of Islam. And these capitals that were on the bottom of the trade route, they became royal cities because it was, a sea of sand, and gold is pouring into these cities. And the Muslims who were living amongst the non-Muslims in the south, they were basically kings, scribes, accountants. They were advisors, translators. These are the ones who were living there in that area. Okay? And by the 11th century, Islam reached the Mandinka people, or Mandingos. By the 13th century, the king of Mali embraced Islam. Okay? That's a caravan. That's a modern day caravan. I took this picture. These are Tawarik people. They rather live outside in the desert instead of live under a building with a roof, right? What's important about Mali? What do you think about African people, right? Remember what they said about Africa? Poor, refugees. I want you to Google, not right now because I will ruin my class, but when you get a chance, who is the richest man who ever lived? Google it. Was it Rothschild? Oppenheimer? Kennedy? With Nizam of Hyderabad? Who was it? It was a black man and Muslim named Mansa Musa, Kankan Musa. The richest man who ever lived on earth. See how much lies they talk about Africa? Mansa Musa made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, and he carried with him 72,000 people. They crossed the Sahara Desert. They had 15,000 camels laden with gold. Every place he went to, he changed the economy. When he came into Egypt, the Bahri Mamluks were great warriors of Egypt, they fell in love with Mansa Musa. And they gave him a Mamluk cavalry to take him for Hajj. When he came back, he gave stipends in gold to anybody who would return with him, who would teach, architects who would build masjids and schools. So everywhere he stopped, he was building a mosque, building a school. Everywhere he was going back. This is the great Mansa Musa. In the red is Timbuktu. And you might know the word Timbuktu. They used to use the word Timbuktu as somewhere you're lost. They said, oh, go to Timbuktu. That means go get lost. You know what Timbuktu actually was? Timbuktu was a center of knowledge. You know who started Timbuktu? A woman. Her name was Baktu. And Timbuktu in Tamashek language, which is Amazigh language, it means the well of Baktu. So she founded the city when the Tuaregs would come across the desert, right? And then it became a center not only of gold trade, but of knowledge. And it is said by the great historians, the most important thing in Timbuktu was gold. Secondly, a book. Every man, woman, and child in Timbuktu by the 16th century was literate. Everybody. Every house had Hafiz al-Quran. In Timbuktu, the Sankore University in the 16th century, it had 25,000 students. Now, have you ever heard of anything like this before? 25,000 students. They were studying not only Islamic studies, they were studying astronomy, math, they were doing cataract operations. This is what's in the books we have right now, talking about Timbuktu. Okay? That's a picture of what is now. Of course, this is back. The desert has come in. French colonialism, took over the place. The boats started coming. The desert was no longer a good place for trade. Trade was coming by the ocean. So now Timbuktu is a dusty place. But there's still thousands of books that are there. And there are libraries, archival sites, with thousands of books in classical Arabic language. Still there in Timbuktu. Now, the slave trade. The next issue now is the slave trade to the Americas. And this kicks in between the 1500 to 1870 or so. And you can see by this map the places where African slaves and political prisoners were brought into the Americas. Okay, these are the ports of call. Surprisingly enough, there was resistance to slavery. There was resistance in Africa. There was resistance on the boats. There was resistance in the Caribbean, in the United States, in South America. And what is not so well known is that in West Africa itself, there was a resistance movement. You can look up these people. This is Al-Mami or Al-Imam, Abdul Qadir Khan of the Futa Toro. Right? He was a Fulani man, and he was a scholar of the Quran and Maliki fiqh, jurisprudence. He lived in a place called Bundu, right, in the Futa Toro, which is now like Guinea and Senegal, and the regions are there, the Futa Toro. He started a resistance movement against slavery. And he led a major rebellion around 1776, and he formed an anti-slavery movement. There's a book called The Walking Quran, which by Rudolph T. Ware III, where you can, if you want to, you can get it online. Documented evidence, about this abolitionist movement amongst African Muslims. Okay, The Walking Quran. This is a letter that was written by the Imam to the French Governor Blanchot in St. Louis in 1789. He said, "We are warning you that all those who will come to our land to trade in slaves will be killed or massacred if you do not send our children back." Now he's threatening the French. Would not somebody who was very hungry abstain from eating if he had to eat something cooked with his blood? We absolutely do not want you to buy Muslims under any circumstances. I repeat, if your intention is to always buy Muslims, you should stay home and not come to our country anymore, because all those who will come can be assured they will lose their life. Right? This is a threatening letter by the Imam. And his people were basically Muslims, right? That's why he's talking about them. This is also a letter written by the British governor of Senegal. The British governor of Senegal said this. He said, "It may be necessary to remark that there has been greater facility in negotiating with al-Imami Abdul Qadir, and less probability of again having disputes with him in consequence of the abolition of the slave trade. A commerce which the Prince Abdul Qadir always opposed as being contrary to the laws of his religion, and means through which several of his subjects, followers of the Prophet, were led into captivity. This is the British governor saying it. When the British wanted to finish with slavery, it was already done. So he said it's going to be easy to work with the Imam Abdul Qadir Khan. Easy, because he already was against it. So this is now the witness of the British themselves. The French governor of Senegal, a decade later, nothing could take away from these Fullers, being the Fulani people, or the Fuller people, the idea that in forbidding the trade in slaves, the Europeans were emboldened by their example. They are proud to have bypassed us in the progress of reason, justice, and humanity. This is what the French governor said, right? Talking about Muslims and their resistance to slavery. Now, the shocking information we're finding out is that somewhere between 15 to 30% of the enslaved African people brought to the Americas were Muslims. In some places, it's more than 30%. And what is happening, there's a number of eyewitness reports, written documents, autobiographies in Arabic, which are coming to the surface. So you can get Arabic documents written in Jamaica, Brazil, Trinidad, Haiti, United States. You can get Arabic documents written by slaves. Resistance to slavery. The Senegambian people, they were the first Africans to be sold in the New World. And in 1522, the Wolof, a proud people of Senegal, they rebelled in Hispaniola, which is Haiti and Dominican Republic. They also rebelled in Puerto Rico, and they rebelled in Panama. So there was resistance, in many cases led by the Muslims. And I want to show you how we identify this. Because somebody would say, well, how do you identify them? What's your proof, man? Okay, if you look closely at this, I don't have a laser printer, but a pointer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The fifth line down. Okay, the fourth line, it says, he's talking about a runaway, right? Runaway slaves, right? And the fourth line, he said, a short, well-made Negro fella called Mahomet. You see it? Mahomet. You see it in italics? Mahomet. That word Mahomet, that means Muhammad. They were using that in Europe. So he's identifying this runaway slave as a Muslim. This is how we piece the information together. So there are a number of different documents like this, and especially the Mandingos. The Mandingos were they were feared by the slave masters. This is a great leader, Abdurrahman ibn Ibrahim, and he is also he's actually born in Bundu, educated in Timbuktu. In 1762, he was enslaved in Mississippi, returned home in 1829. See the Arabic there? Below his picture, Ismuhu Abdurrahman. See it? He was a prince leading 2,000 people in an army who had attacked his land. He was captured after the victory, put on a boat, taken to Mississippi. And he eventually won his freedom, and he returned to West Africa. And this is his actual picture, taken in Mississippi. Ayub ibn Sulaiman, or Job bin Solomon. He was born in 1700 in Bundu, eastern Senegal. He was taken to Maryland. He was a scholar, prayed 5 times a day. He wrote the whole Quran from his memory. Okay? He was freed. Now, when the American government found out about him and about Abdurrahman, they said to the slave master, free them. Why? Because George Washington, President of the United States, when the Americans needed to have a country to recognize them, he signed a treaty with the Sultan of Morocco, Abdullah ibn Muhammad. He signed a treaty, and the Moroccans were the first country to recognize the United States. The treaty is in Tangier, in Tanja. If you go to Tangiers now, you will find the treaty there from George Washington and the Sultan. So because of this, Washington stipulated any Moorish person, they call them Moors, any Muslim African person who is found in slavery should be freed. That's an agreement. Okay? So he was freed. Yaro Mahmud, he died at the age of 128, 70 years in slavery. Can you imagine that? He died at 128. Umar bin Sayyid, he wrote his whole biography in Arabic, and it still exists. Bilali Muhammad, a former cleric, was enslaved in Sapelo Island in Georgia. Saleh Bilali was captured at 14, riding from Jenneh to Kiana. He spent over 60 years in slavery. Lizzie Gray, a Muslim woman who died in South Carolina, was reported to have said, now, what they used to do is they would force you to accept Christianity, right? But then sometimes they weren't sure. If you showed some Islam, they weren't sure, so they test you. So they said to old Lizzie Gray, can you tell us about Christ? And this is in one of their books. You know what she said? Christ built the first church in Mecca, and his grave was there. Okay? What do you think she was saying? Now, Mecca, actually, the knowledge and whatever, she meant Medina, right? She said Christ built the first church, Mecca, Medina, and his grave. Who is she talking about? Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not Jesus Christ, right? That's a resistance, right? It's a form of resistance. Fatima or Phoebe. Fatima or Phoebe, right? The wife of Saleh, of Bilali Muhammad. Sapelo Islands. See the dress of the African people off the coast of Georgia. That's how they dressed. Okay, so there was the presence. We can take I can finish, and then we can take an intermission and have questions afterwards. I'm almost done. Francois Macandal. You're living in a French area, right? You know Haitian people, right? Haiti, right? There are a lot of Haitians in Montreal. Okay? The Haitians were Haiti was the first country in the Western world to liberate itself from colonialism. The Haitians defeated the French on the ground, and their great leader Toussaint Louverture. But you know what a lot of people don't understand? Before their great general Toussaint took over, there were rebellions in the plantations. And it is recorded that Francois Macandal and another person called Bookman, they were what they call marabout. They say marabout in Senegal language. It means in Arabic, murabit. They were murabit, which meant they were traveling scholars. Traveling scholars. They started the rebellion. And Toussaint Louverture organized the rebellion. This is resistance to slavery. In Jamaica, there are people called Maroons. These are areas of the Maroons of Jamaica. Maroon rebellions. When the Spanish came and the slaves ran away to the mountains. So they call them cimarrones, which mean a wild horse. Right? And they later took the name Maroon. These liberated areas of Maroons, these are some of the great leaders of the rebellions in Jamaica. Nani, different leaders of their resistance. And in this area in Trelawney, in this area, there were Muslims. There's a place called Jum'ah Hole, where they used to make Salatul Jum'ah. So Maroon Rebellion is also connected with, there were other people beside Muslims, but the Maroon Rebellion is connected to this. Muhammad Kaaba from Buka, from Malinke, Guinea. He was studying to be a judge, captured at 20 and deported to Jamaica. Abu Bakr Siddiq was writing in Arabic language. Extensive writings. See the writings how they look? These are coming to the surface now. Is a legacy of resistance through scholarship. They resisted slavery in any way they could. And they kept writing things. This here is a document. Remember Abdurrahman? This is a document here. And this document, I want to read it to you. We're right near the end. It says, a copy of the Lord's Prayer written by Prince Abdul Rahman in Arabic at my request on the 29th of December 1828. Right? He's a missionary, right? And he wants to try to make Abdurrahman Christian. So he said to him, you know Arabic, right? Can you write the Lord's Prayer in Arabic? The Lord's Prayer is from the Bible. It says, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. That's how it starts. So he should have said, Rabbuna alladhi fis sama. He didn't say that. This is what he wrote. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. He wrote the Fatiha. But the missionary didn't know what he was writing. You understand what he did? It said Lord's Prayer in Arabic. He wrote the Fatiha, the opening chapter of the Quran. And now we today can come and see what he actually did. He resisted the missionary. You see it? So even through scholarship, there is resistance. This is Umar bin Sayyid. These are some of the writings of the great rebellions and the great ulama. Whole Quran from their memory. The legacy amongst the Muslim slaves was Tawheed, their monotheism and their unity. Tahara, purity of mind, body, sexual relationships. Al-amru bil ma'ruf wa nahi al-munkar, calling to the good and forbidding evil. That's how they were known, and that legacy continues. You know Malcolm X? You ever heard of Malcolm X? Whenever people have Black History Month, they talk about Malcolm X. They talk about Martin Luther King, right? But today, more and more people are recognizing Malcolm X. But what they do not recognize about Malcolm X, before he died, he had embraced Islam, true Islam. He had made Hajj, and this is one of the final pictures of Malcolm X. He doesn't have a bow tie on in his suit. See him in the middle? The clothes of the ulama. And he is carrying, he has a book. And this is the legacy of resistance, the legacy of Malcolm, the legacy starting with Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, who led an anti-slavery movement, who gave us this feeling. And Muslims who go back to their traditions could not be involved in slavery. They would resist slavery everywhere they possibly could. I leave you with these thoughts. We'll be taking a break. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.